Welcome to Vote Who, the brand new programme with me, Ken Livingstone, the show where you ask the election questions the mainstream media find too hot to handle. We're live today, as we will be every day this week during the run-up to the British general election. In today's show, we want to discuss a range of crucially important issues that are simply not being talked about. We've been out and about with our cameras, and we recorded some questions you wanted to put to our guest. But Vote Who is also a phone-in programme, and we want you to call and challenge our guests today. The number to call is +44 208 601 4555. You can also text on +44 7800 008066, or you can send us an email at votewho@presstv.co.uk. You can then question our guests. Today with us we have Carol Turner, a spokesperson for the Stop the War Coalition, as well as Jan Toporowski, a specialist in banking regulation who lectures at SOAS. Let's start with you, Carol. If you think what isn't being discussed at this election, what immediately comes to mind?
Don't mention the war. It's absolutely amazing. It's such a big thing in people's minds, particularly in relation to the economy and the cost of war, and yet no one is mentioning it. There's a silence amongst all the mainstream parties. Basically, they all favour remaining in Afghanistan, and they don't want to discuss what happened or what continues to happen in Iraq.
The Lib Dems overwhelmingly voted against going into Iraq, and one would have assumed they might be more keen to disengage than the two main parties.
Well, maybe. I suspect that if they end up in some form of power-sharing government, we won't actually see that. When you're a smaller party, it's very easy to put forward your views without taking into account any of the other political parties that you're going to be in government with, and I suspect they're doing that. For instance, we're really pleased that they're opposing the replacement of Trident. That's absolutely great. But I have to be honest and say that I can imagine them in a coalition government with either Labour or Conservative saying, well, we don't really support it, however, we're not in control, we can't do anything about it. And I suspect that will be the case on what's happening in Iraq, Afghanistan and so on.
Yeah, and you're an expert on banking. Have you been surprised how little this election has been about the banks? That none of the parties are trying to outscore each other on who's going to be toughest on bankers' bonuses. Why isn't banking, it's been the biggest crisis since World War II, why isn't banking right up there?
Well, I think that it should be right up there, and it's something very regrettable to me that it isn't being discussed. The banking crisis has effectively been transformed to some extent by the media, but to a very great extent by certain interests, I guess, in the commercial and banking establishment. It's been transformed from a banking crisis into a crisis ostensibly of the state of the British of the British government, and the fact is the British government finances are nowhere as bad as they have been in the past, and the issues that brought on the banking crisis still remain, and they're not just issues of bankers' bonuses, although that does reflect some appalling attitudes towards the distribution of income in our society, but issues like, say, the housing market, the way in which the housing market is a cash cow for people of our age, but for young people it's a very, very serious burden, particularly young people in big conurbations like London.
Why aren't we, given this, you've got I think 2 million people on council waiting list, why isn't there an issue of parties competing like they used to say we'll build more housing for rent?
I think to some extent this is happening, but the other side of it is that one sees a some ugly side of community politics, which is that you say, oh, okay, there is an issue about council housing, but then it's an issue because there are outsiders who are getting council housing. There are political refugees who are getting council housing. And the suggestion is that they are the problem and not the housing problem, and not housing itself, not the availability of social housing itself.
Do you think that the Conservatives seem to have latched onto this crisis as a way of being able to make cuts that even Mrs Thatcher didn't dream of?
I think to some extent, but also to neglect the whole issue of social housing. I think that there is there were balances. There have been balances built up in local government from the sale of council houses, which they effectively froze and utilised to finance the central government, which have been used to finance central government rather than being put back in the community. And that's the kind of thing.
Tenants won't be happy to know they're subsidising central government as well as their taxes.
Exactly.
Anyhow, let's go to our first question.
Well, I don't think our troops should be in Afghanistan. Are the political parties going to remove our troops?
Well, we have your immediate response to that already, Carol. I say, Jan, what do you think about this? I mean, you come here mainly to talk about banks, but you must have a strong opinion about Afghanistan.
I have a very strong opinion on Afghanistan, really drawn from reports that I've had. I did some work recently for the UN, and I spoke to the man who was head of the UN in Afghanistan, and essentially, he said that it was the problem was that of a quagmire. That once for various opportunistic reasons, once governments had got themselves involved in Afghanistan, it becomes very, very difficult to pull out, in particular to pull out without leaving a bloodbath of the communities that supported what's in effect an occupying power now in Afghanistan.
Carol,
but somehow it has to be pulled out.
Carol, I mean, we're hearing talk that's died down during the election, before the election, that there might need to be a deal with the better elements of the Taliban. I mean, are we just simply going to end up in 2 or 3 years' time, we will have left, but we'll have put the Taliban back in just with some undertaking they're not going to allow Al-Qaeda a base or something?
It's going to be something like that. The war's unwinnable. Just to put it in economic terms, the US is spending almost 10 times more on the war than the Afghan government's its income in a year. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that you can't have the situation that all the political parties are claiming, which is that they're training the Afghan troops to take over. It's just not physically possible. I think I'm in favour of negotiating with the parties, because I'm not in favour of war. War is a last resort. I'm not a pacifist, but I don't think starting a war as a means of changing a situation is necessarily effective. We've got a whole history on Afghanistan, people going in and not and being forced out, and I think that's going to happen to Britain and America.